The Panama Canal is one of the most important trade routes in the entire world, and it is incredibly important for the United States. Around $270 billion in global trade pass through the canal every single year. It allows shipping companies as well as the U.S. Navy to quickly and easily move from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean without having to bypass the entire continent of South America. However, apparently it has also become a grave political threat to the United States, at least according to President Trump.
Panama's promise to us has been broken. The purpose of our deal and the spirit of our treaty has been totally violated. American ships are being severely overcharged and not treated fairly in any way, shape, or form, and that includes the United States Navy. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
I want to understand why exactly he said this, as well as some other statements leading up to the election, and we're going to talk about all of that in this video. It's clear that this is one of the most important foreign policy focuses for his presidency, at least in his second term. We've already discussed why he is so fascinated with Greenland and why Greenland actually has a case to be that important to the United States. You can check it out in that video, and I'll link you to that at the end of this video. We're basically going to do a very similar thing. Instead of going through the PMESI PT framework that we went through with Greenland, we're just going to focus on some of the more significant factors around the Panama Canal, just the canal. Since obviously we're not trying to annex Panama here, it's really more just a conversation about why the canal itself is so important. We're also going to discuss what the risks are to the United States if it does nothing, and what the risks are if it does something. Firstly, let's get a baseline of information on the canal itself. And this will help us quickly understand exactly why it is so important and crucial for the United States, both economically and militarily. The Panama Canal is really one of the most important trade zones in the entire world. For just a small toll, and we'll discuss the toll structure here in a little bit, it allows ships passing from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and vice versa to transit about a 40-mile canal area. How it was built here is, of course, very important for the story. In 1881, France began construction on the Panama Canal. However, they had to eventually abandon the construction in around 1890. At this time, Panama was still very much a part of Colombia. However, at the start of the 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt took an interest in the canal, and so he started negotiating with Colombia for a deal where the United States would take control of the canal zone and would finish the construction. Colombia, of course, didn't want to play ball, and at the time, Panama wanted independence, so Teddy Roosevelt supported the Panamanian independence movement in exchange for a quickly negotiated canal zone, and that's basically exactly what happened. In 1904, the U.S. resumed the construction of the Panama Canal, and they finished in 1914. This wasn't as simple as it might sound, however. It was an incredibly expensive and deadly endeavor. The French committed around $287 million, which is over $9.73 billion in today's money, just to abandon the project after less than 10 years. And the U.S. spent over $375 million, which today is over $12 billion, to finish the project. Of course, it is well over budget. To boot, workers that were working on the project had to deal with all kinds of local diseases, as well as all kinds of accidents from the construction, and really just terrible living conditions. The French lost around 22,000 workers while they were working on the project, and the U.S. would lose around 5,600 workers. This also led to extensive flooding of local forests and villages. This is otherwise an extremely impressive project. It required the construction of, at the time, the world's largest dam, which dammed up the Chagres River. It also led to extensive excavation, which cut through very rugged and mountainous terrain to create this canal. It also had the relocation of a large railway built in the mid-1800s. Once the U.S. completed construction, it was open for business, and the U.S. maintained control of the canal for the following 5 decades. However, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The Cold War had a dramatic impact on U.S. relations throughout Latin America, and this was, of course, true for U.S.-Panamanian relations. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. had been involved in numerous coups and revolutions throughout Latin America, really trying to hunt out communism and exert its control over the hemisphere. This led to a lot of skepticism of the United States and really resentment for the United States throughout Latin America, and of course, that meant in Panama. In 1964, riots broke out between Panamanian citizens as well as local U.S. residents working on the canal over the right to fly the Panamanian flag over the canal. Of course, the U.S. citizens there wanted to keep only the American flag waving over the canal, but Panamanians wanted more representation. This led to very immediate and extensive negotiations over who would have control over the canal zone. And this kicked kicked off under President Ford and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, with the Panamanian President Marco Robles. Ford was a fan of the idea of transitioning control of the canal to Panama, and so was Henry Kissinger. In fact, Kissinger remarked that if the canal negotiations failed, the U.S. would be beaten to death in every international forum, and there would be riots all over Latin America. Of course, the Ford presidency would later transition out and the Nixon administration would come in, but that did not necessarily change the fact that Nixon himself also wanted to move on from the Panama Canal. So negotiations continued under Nixon, and that laid the groundwork for later President Jimmy Carter to finish the job. Meanwhile, in Panama, a series of coups brought about a new series of political leadership. This led to an increased sense of urgency with getting a deal done because the U.S. was skeptical of what the political situation in Panama would look like and how easy it would be to maintain control over it. And of course, Panama just wanted the canal back. Finally, in 1977, the two sides came together on a final agreement. The treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, which is a mouthful and it kind of gives away the premise of the treaty, was one of the first agreements to come about. The second treaty, of course, was the Panama Canal Treaty, which is much more restrained in terms of naming, which is good, but it also formally transitioned power over the canal to Panama on December 31st, 1999. Of course, there was a brief hiccup in 1989 whenever President H.W. Bush launched an invasion of Panama to oust then Panamanian President Manuel Noriega. However, that did not change the course for the canal's transition over to Panama, and of course, now we are where we are. So that's the history, and as you can tell, it's a little controversial. There was significant congressional resistance to the idea of transitioning the canal over to the Panamanians in the 1970s. That didn't, however, amount to much because, of course, the Senate was able to pass and approve these treaties with a 2/3 majority. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't noticed a lot of other Americans really thinking about the Panama Canal since this happened. And this is really why Trump's comments about the Panama Canal seem so out of place. And maybe it's because we're just not paying so much attention, so let's dig in a little bit deeper here. The canal itself is about 40 miles in length, and it can accommodate ships at about just under 1,000 feet in length and about 100 feet in width. These dimensions of ships are what's nicknamed Panamax ships, meaning that they are capable of traversing the Panama Canal. An expansion in 2016 introduced larger locks, which allowed for larger, what's called Neo-Panamax ships at 1,400 feet in length and about 180 feet in width. Obviously, of course, larger container ships, ultra-crude carriers, as well as aircraft carriers and other types of larger naval vessels aren't able to traverse the Panama Canal. They still have to take the long way around. Now, what exactly is the long way and why does it matter? Right now, the long way is an extensive 8,000 nautical mile trip around South America. In the future, it could also include a secondary route around North America by way of Greenland down through the Bering Strait by Alaska. That's something we discussed more in the Greenland video and more on why that exactly is going to be important moving forward. But there is a cost and benefit to taking the canal as opposed to taking the extensive journey. In terms of costs, ships have to pay a toll of about $90 per 20-foot equivalent unit for fully loaded ships. Now, if you're like me and you had to look up what exactly a 20-foot equivalent unit is, it's basically a 20-foot Conex box that's basically a shipping container 20 feet in length. Most shipping containers are about 40 feet in length, and that is 2 TEUs. So a Panamax vessel can carry about 5,000 TEUs worth of cargo, while a Neo-Panamax vessel can carry about 14,000 units. Meaning that each fully loaded Panamax vessel will have to pay the Panamanian government about $300,000 to traverse the canal, while every Neo-Panamax vessel will have to pay around $840,000. Year to year, that means the Panamanian government makes about $3 billion each year just in the traversal tolls alone. That doesn't include the subsequent costs of support staff spending their salaries in the country, tourism, and all that kind of stuff. 2024 was a big year despite some major ecological hiccups, which we'll talk about in a moment. Panama generated about $3.45 billion in 2024. That's a lot of money going to Panama, but it's also a big expense for ships passing through. Now, yes, consider how much money these shipping companies are making, so it's certainly not that bad. But if you consider the cost of going through the canal versus all the labor costs, the fuel costs, the maintenance costs, as well as the time savings or the time lost taking the longer route, it's certainly worth it to just take the canal. Now, because of those potential losses of taking the long way, pretty much everybody that can use the canal does use the canal. By and large, that means that the United States represents about 70% of total traversals through the canal each year. However, a distant second is Chinese ships. And while it is a distant distant second, it is certainly no less notable, especially given all the tensions between the US and China and the concern from the Trump administration of China's threat to the United States. Trump has also made a point to point out how the Panama Canal is being quote-unquote run by China, in that China is trying to take over the canal themselves. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. However, if you put all of the Panama Canal's users together, you have about 5% of global trade passing through the canal. Now, that's not a lot whenever you consider the Suez Canal as another canal, which makes up about 12% of global trade, but it is certainly not that small. It's a lot of trade that's going through each year. It's also not that bad compared to the Suez Canal because they don't have the kinds of threat groups in the area that the Suez has. For example, if you pass through the Suez Canal, you're probably passing around the Horn of Africa, which has a piracy problem. You've got the Houthis in Yemen, you've got Iran, and you've also got Syria and Hezbollah. Panama doesn't really have that problem. There's Venezuela, but they're really not that bad, and they're not in the business of bothering commercial shipping, at least for now. Now, a key feature about the Panama Canal is the locks, which, if you're not familiar with what a lock is, basically a ship will float into a particular square area. The area will fill up with water, and that will basically change the height or the altitude of the ship so it can continue on. That's because it's not all at sea level. So ships need to basically increase or decrease their altitude to continue to traverse the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal uses about 7 billion liters of lake water from Lake Gaston, which is a rain-fed reservoir. Usually it's not an issue that it's a rain-fed reservoir, as Panama tends to get plenty of rain and that feeds the reservoir. However, in the past couple years, Panama has been undergoing a slight drought. It appears to be changing, and they've been getting some rain lately. However, at the end of 2023 and early 2024, this was a significant problem, and that impacted the Panama Canal's ability to function. Of course, this led to restrictions in just how much traffic the canal could accommodate, and that led to some significant backlogs. To add to the Panama Canal's current problems or list of growing problems, they might have a new competitor coming around sometime in the near future. Mexico is developing a rail line that's nicknamed the Isthmus of Tehuantepec's Interoceanic Corridor Project. This project is valued at over $2.8 billion, and the line is projected to handle up to 1.4 million TEUs annually by 2033. The best part is that since it's a rail line, it doesn't have to rely on silly things like rainwater to continue operation. It will also reduce the impact on cargo ships, since instead of having to go from let's say Florida to California just on a short trip, they can go from Florida to Mexico, drop off the cargo on the Atlantic coast, and then pick up cargo going the opposite direction, then go back to say Florida. So it will reduce costs to shipping as well as decrease the risk of any kind of ecological disaster. However, this project is certainly not likely to replace the Panama Canal, since the Panama Canal handles over 8 million TEUs annually. But it could certainly dig into its client base, especially if you consider the risk to shipping that we might be talking about here in a little bit. It may also signal that this might be a very valuable opportunity for other Latin American countries that are capable of making this type of an infrastructural investment to do a very similar project. And in aggregate, multiple of these types of rail lines could begin to pose a threat for the profitability of the Panama Canal. So overall, the Panama Canal is an economic beast in this hemisphere, with some key limitations, some limited competition, and a ton of demand. That's the economic side, but whenever we start talking about security, things take a serious turn for the worst. Obviously, the canal is very critical for U.S. Navy mobility. It allows the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets to reinforce one another in a pretty efficient way. Obviously, it's important whenever you consider, say, a conflict happening on the other side of one of the world's largest oceans, and that might involve a very significant naval investment to resolve that conflict. You might have to quickly traverse, ships from the Atlantic fleet to the Pacific fleet, just as an example. I mean, not that I'm calling anything specific here, to handle that crisis. Of course, I've already mentioned that the Panama Canal can't handle aircraft carriers, so carrier strike groups are out of luck. They're going to have to take the long way around anyway. But in a pinch, smaller vessels can certainly make that trip. The U.S. also loves to keep tabs on international trade just to make sure that things are functioning like normal. A healthy global economy means a healthy American economy. And like I already said, there's not really a lot of nearby threats aside from potentially Venezuela, but not really for the U.S. Navy to worry about. And so things seem to be pretty hunky-dory, right? Well, there is a growing concern about China. Of course, China's primary military capabilities are an ocean away on the opposite side of the Pacific. However, they have increased investment throughout Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative, and of course that has increased investment in Panama. Trump stated that China is operating the Panama Canal and that is unacceptable to the United States. That I can find, there's no real evidence that China is operating the Panama Canal. However, there is something interesting. China does have 2 operational ports on either side of the Panama Canal. According to the BBC, 2 of the 5 ports adjacent to the canal have been operated by a subsidiary of a Hong Kong-based corporation since 1997. These are at the port of Cristobal on the Atlantic side and the port of Balboa on the Pacific side. One expert mentioned in the article also voiced a concern about China's investment in these port facilities, saying that they can gain valuable information about the types of cargo and the types of shipping passing through the canal each year, and that could influence China's capabilities with targeting the U.S. supply chain in case of war. I would also like to add that there is an additional risk that we've learned is certainly potent coming out of the war in Ukraine, and that's the threat of unmanned naval vehicles. We've seen just how absolutely efficient and effective these vessels can be in targeting larger ships for very high payoff targeting, in the war in Ukraine, where Ukraine has managed to damage heavily Russia's Black Sea fleet at relatively low cost. During a war with China or any kind of a military crisis with China, China could leverage these 2 port facilities to target U.S. shipping as well as U.S. naval vessels passing through the Panama Canal on either side. And it could do so using drones that up to this point could be hidden in containers that might appear benign with satellite imagery. However, in the case of war, they could just plop the containers into the water, send out a drone, and start targeting ships. Of course, that would be a massive problem. It also doesn't help politically that China has leveraged its investments to gain political concessions out of some of the different countries throughout Latin America. For example, Panama used to be a pro-Taiwan independence country. However, following its involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative, Panama severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan and then became a pro-unification. China may be able to leverage its investments with Panama to also decrease Panama's security relationship with the United States, or at the very least disrupt it. That I understand, these 2 port facilities are not directly part of the Panama Canal infrastructure. Instead, they just service ships that are traversing the canal on either side. So the U.S. seizing control of the Panama Canal would not resolve this issue. It also would not likely change Panama's political decisions to seek a closer trade relationship with China. In fact, any kind of a coercive seizure of the canal might actually hasten Panama's chase towards, greater relations with China. For now, let's consider the risks regardless of who owns or runs the canal. But whether or not these Chinese ports are able to be weaponized in a time of war. China targeting naval vessels with drones poses a high risk not only to the vessels themselves, but to the security of the canal and to the security of really the economic passageway that goes through the canal. It would not only disrupt global shipping passing through the canal and increase the traversal time, it would also really hamper the U.S. Navy's ability to traverse ships through the canal to reinforce the Pacific Fleet. So while you have a security crisis in the world that's already impacting the economy, you have, Chinese drones targeting ships on either side of the Panama Canal, a growing trade backlog because ships are no longer able to traverse the canal, and now the U.S. Atlantic Fleet unable to quickly reinforce the Pacific Fleet, which is already as is completely outmatched by the Chinese fleet. And that all buys time for China with regards to something like Taiwan. This would be a complete disaster, to say the least. And of course, this is all a very hypothetical situation, but I'm just trying to outline and kind of think through what could be the most dangerous course of action that China could take with regard to these port facilities, and really why this could be a national security threat to the United States. Again, we're really just trying to rationalize what President Trump might be looking at here that would make him say some of these statements that he said. And then, of course, takes us right back to his comments where he stated that it's a matter of national security. He stated that he believes China is taking control over the canal, and he's complained about specifically high tolls that the Panamanian government is charging the United States to traverse through the canal. Now, at the start, this all kind of looks more like it's just a negotiating tactic, similar to with Greenland, where Trump makes a pretty bellicose statement to gain some concessions, except in his goal, right, and his main goal might actually just be reducing costs for the United States or U.S. companies. It may not be about actually returning control of the canal to the United States. That being said, it very well could be. It's also worth considering the economic losses that Panama has taken on managing this canal, especially in the past couple of years with the drought, where it's not able to accommodate the kind of traffic that it's used to accommodating. That's backed things up economically and with shipping, and that's also reduced the amount of money that Panama can make in terms of tolls and with the subsequent, injects of money that come from operating the canal. That, of course, is costly for everybody. That said, Trump does have some amount of leverage here. Consider how the United States makes up around 70% of the canal's traffic. If Trump threatened to hold back U.S. shipping from traversing through the canal, that would be absolutely devastating for Panama. So while the Panama Canal accounts for about 3 to 5% of the Panamanian total GDP, whenever you factor in things like tourism as all the related services for maintaining the canal might really be accommodating for around 40% of the Panamanian GDP. And while withholding U.S. shipping through the canal wouldn't totally crater that entire 40% of their GDP, it would certainly eat a pretty sizable chunk of it. However, that said, I think that we might be focused on the wrong thing here, at least in terms of threat picture. The canal and its security isn't exactly the real problem here. I mean, it's certainly a consideration. It could be considered an economic problem, for example, and that might be what Trump is trying to target here. However, it's not the real potentially devastating problem that we could have on hand. And that real problem could be the threat of those two Chinese-owned ports on either side of the Panama Canal that are not part of the canal infrastructure. So again, they remain there and they remain operational regardless of who owns the Panama Canal. The U.S. does not have similar facilities on either side of the Panama Canal. The U.S. doesn't have any permanent security or military infrastructure in Panama. So in terms of response, it would be incredibly difficult and it would take a while to get any kind of sizable response to the area if something were to happen. Trump has threatened to use military force, for example, to retake the Panama Canal. And in doing so, he could establish permanent military facilities either on the canal or on either side of the canal. Just generally speaking, this would be downright silly. We've already established that the canal itself and control over the canal isn't the real threat here, but economically it wouldn't provide much benefit either. $3 billion a year sounds like a lot of money. However, forcibly taking control over it would impact trade to the United States and diplomatic relationships with the United States. And economically speaking, the U.S. might actually incur a loss with taking over the canal. That also doesn't consider the fact that the U.S. would be losing out on lives and treasure just trying to enforce this military seizure. Right now, at least before this diplomatic spat began, the U.S. and Panama had a pretty decent relationship. The U.S. has been able to maintain joint naval exercises with the Panamanians, especially as part of the enforcement of their 1977 neutrality treaty. However, of course, like I've already mentioned, the U.S. doesn't maintain a permanent presence in Panama. Because of the neutrality treaty of 1977, China can't gain preferential treatment over the canal, nor can they gain any kind of control over the canal that could benefit them in a significant way. In fact, forcing Panama to give preferential treatment to the United States would actually violate the 1977 neutrality agreement. So all that is to say that forcefully taking over the Panama Canal wouldn't really provide any benefit for the United States, and it might actually incur some costs. Also consider the broader implications of the U.S. applying coercive military pressure to gain whatever it wants. Yes, I know that the U.S. has done this before in the past, but we're supposed to be reformed now. We don't do any of that anymore. We just spent the past several years lambasting Russia for doing this very thing in Ukraine, and we've outlined what would happen if China tried to do the same thing over Taiwan. If we decide to get into this business, China very well may decide that this is a green light and then make a move on Taiwan. And to reduce risks to themselves, they could, of course, activate those ports outside of the Panama Canal and that most dangerous scenario, and then we're off to the races. And then the cost to the United States absolutely skyrocket. At this point, we're not worried about the canal anymore. No, we're worried more about the outside infrastructure and the supporting infrastructure around the canal. And all of this takes me to the final conclusion that I'm going to be honest here, I don't really see what the whole thing is with the canal right now. With my Greenland video, we learned some of the case on why, and really there were a couple intersecting reasons why Greenland would be a good deal for the United States. Of course, politically there were some risks and costs, but that's all for you to find out in that video. However, the discussion here appears to be focused on the wrong thing. At least in my assessment, this shouldn't be about the canal itself, but it should be about the supporting and sustainment infrastructure around the canal. Panama has the canal, and they will continue to have the canal into the future. China's probably not going to be taking the canal, and I think that that's perfectly fine. However, the U.S. does need to increase its level of awareness and protection on either side of the canal, whether that is the development and establishment of joint U.S. Panamanian naval facilities on either side of the Panama Canal that can not only monitor the Chinese ports, but also enforce the 1977 treaty and also just maintain a general level of security around the Panama Canal. I think that that would benefit not just Panama, but it would also greatly benefit the United States. And it would reduce the risks of attacks on civilian shipping in the area. It would also bring in other revenue areas for the Panamanian government with, U.S. military and contract personnel then getting into Panama, spending their money in Panama, and that's really just a good thing for everybody. In all likelihood, these two Chinese ports are probably just two benign ports that service ships in the area and get paid and spend their money, and they just have a good time like everybody else. However, there is that little bit of risk, that 1% chance these might not be benign ports. And that may itself warrant further scrutiny. Instead of focusing on the canal, perhaps we should be expanding our vision, focusing a little bit broader to capture the actual risks in the region. And I think that that takes us to where the real gold is here. It would not only make the United States safer, I think it would make Panama much more happy and profitable. And all told, it would all remain within the framework of the 1977 Neutrality Treaty. Seems simple enough to me. Who knows what's going through President Trump's mind at the end of the day? I certainly do not. Maybe he is thinking about these two ports whenever he's thinking about the risk to U.S. shipping and Chinese control over the canal. However, in the meantime, while he's talking about the canal, all eyes are going to be on the canal. So that's what drew the inspiration for this video. And if it gives us an opportunity to learn more about the situation, then I'm happy enough. So comment what you think is going on here and what you think should be done. Do you think that the canal is as important to U.S. security as what President Trump says? If this video was helpful or informative, hit that like button. It really helps this video reach new audiences and it helps the channel grow. And hit subscribe if you want to get more videos just like this, analyzing global conflicts and other types of international relations issues. With all that, I'll see you all later, and how about those Chiefs?